class, this video is for Unit 2, which is on tissues or histology. Okay, so histology is the study of tissues. So tissues are made up of a group of cells, okay, that are all similar in their structure, function, and their embryonic origin. Okay, so that just means that they originate from the same cell when the fetus is developing. So there are 4 main types of tissue in the human body, and then there's subtypes within those that we'll get into. But the 4 main types of tissue are epithelial tissue. So this is like skin tissue, so epithelial. Okay, so this would be like our skin, and it also makes up our organs as well. Connective tissue. This is like support tissue for epithelial tissue. So connective tissue typically has a blood supply to it, whereas epithelial tissue does not, so helps to bring nutrients to the epithelial tissue. So connective tissue. Then we have muscle tissue. Okay, and there's 3 types of muscles. So smooth muscles are found in the organs. Cardiac muscle is found just surrounding the heart, and then we have skeletal muscle, which helps us to move our bones, or move our body in general. And then finally we have nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, okay? So nervous tissue is for rapid communication. So sending information throughout the body quickly. So sending signals, and it tells our muscles to move, or tells our glands to secrete things. It is the control of everything in our body. Okay. So first, before we get into all these tissues, I want to talk about cell junctions. So a junction is where things meet together. So cell junctions are how cells meet together, or how they're connected to each other. So there are a few different types of cell junctions that we're going to talk about. Erase this for now. Okay. So yeah, it's basically how cells are held together, so that contact between the cells is known as the cell junction. So first we have tight junctions. Tight junctions. I'm gonna write junctions as JXN. Okay, junctions, it's just a little shorthand, okay? So tight junctions between the cells, so say we have 2 neighboring cells here, okay? So let's talk actually a little bit about epithelial tissue first. So epithelial tissue, let's say we're talking about squamous tissue. So it's these scale-like shaped cells. And like I said, this is epithelial tissue here. These would be squamous cells. Here's their nuclei. Whenever we're talking about epithelial tissue, there's almost always going to be connective tissue underneath it. So there will be a basement membrane here, and then it separates the epithelial tissue from the connective tissue, and underneath we'll have some sort of epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is made up of fibers, ground substance, and cells. So this here will be our connective tissue. So when we're talking about our junctions, our cell junctions, we're talking about usually between the cells here. Okay, so like here, here, in between all of the cells. Okay, right here. So how these cells connect with each other. Or we can be talking about how the cell attaches to the basement membrane. There's one type that does that, which are hemidesmosomes. Okay, but all the other 3 that we're going to talk about are between the actual cells here. Okay, so just a note as to kind of what we're talking about here. Okay, so say here we have 2 plasma membranes of 2 different cells. So here's cell 1, so let's just draw this as a columnar cell, we'll say. And here's our second cell here. So here's our plasma membranes. Remember, that's the covering of the cell, the outside of the cell. When we have tight junctions, these are very close together. So let's actually redraw this. They're basically touching each other. Okay, so there's our two columnar cells. So we have our plasma membranes adjacent to one another, right next to each other. Okay, and there's going to be some areas of space. So let's say like here, for example, there's a little space, but tight junctions, right? So this connection is pretty tight. Okay, so there's going to be a few areas of a tiny bit of space, but not much space there. Okay, and then here we have it kind of drawn out already. Okay, so there we have our little space, and then we have transmembrane proteins that connect the cells. So let's draw that in a different color and a little bit smaller. Let's use our red here. Okay, so here we have our transmembrane proteins that connect everything together. So you'll find this throughout the cells that are joined together. Okay, so something like this. Okay, so this here in red that I drew, this would be the transmembrane protein. So what is a transmembrane protein, first of all? So transmembrane means it can be embedded within the plasma membrane. Okay, so it goes through the plasma membrane. It could actually be embedded within that cell covering that plasma membrane there. Okay, so these transmembrane proteins connect these two cells together. Okay, so these are found where we don't want things to get through, except what we really need to get through. So very small things, maybe like ions. Okay, so this is found within lining our organs. Okay, so remember I said epithelial tissue lines our organs as well. So our stomach is very acidic, right, in order to break down our food further. So you'll find these tight junctions in the epithelial cells of the stomach, so that our stomach acid does not seep through. That would be very dangerous, right, because it would cause damage to our other organs. Okay, so tight junctions found in our organs, like our stomach, lining our bladder as well. We don't want urine getting anywhere within our body. Okay, and lining the intestines. Okay, so tight junctions are to prevent any organ contents from seeping out. Okay, so that's tight junctions. Next we have adherence junctions. So let's draw some cells next to each other, or let's use this one here. It's weird, yeah. So this one here is tight junctions. This here is adherence junction. Okay, so that'll be this one here. Okay, adherence junctions. So here we still have adjacent plasma membranes, okay? And then we have these actin filament plaques. Okay? So they're gonna kind of come to the side. Make sure you refer to the PowerPoint to see what it actually looks like in a nicer cartoon drawing than what I'm drawing here. Okay, so we have these actin filaments here, which are just another type of protein. We'll learn a lot more about it when we get to muscle contraction. Okay, so here we have these, and then here we have a plaque here. Same thing here, a plaque and more actin proteins. Okay, and then there's these proteins that connect them together. Okay, so they're kind of connected, or they're connected together this way. Okay. So these here in the middle will be our transmembrane proteins that go through the membrane there. Okay. So this is to help reduce separation of epithelial cells from each other, right? It helps to hold them together. Okay. So this is found in epithelial tissue, so like in our skin, okay, on the outside of our body, typically right underneath tight junctions. So we don't want things getting into our body from our skin, right, because that could be very dangerous. So we do have these tight junctions, but right underneath those, then we would have these adherence junctions. Okay, so a few different ways to protect our body here. Okay, so that's adherence junctions. Next we have desmosomes. Let me write that here, desmosomes. Okay. So desmosomes, it looks somewhat similar to the adherens junction, so let's draw our cells next to each other. So we're going to keep with the columnar shaped cells. Okay. And then we also have a plaque here, similar to in the adherens junction, and here. Okay, so we have our plaque there. Okay. And then we have intermediate filament, which is going to be made up of keratin, another type of protein. And we'll talk about keratin in detail in Unit 3 when we get to skin or integumentary system. Okay, so our plaque actually goes a bit further back here and a bit further back here. And then we have our keratin filaments on our plaque here. Okay, so that's our keratin protein there. And then again, we have our transmembrane proteins helping to anchor everything. Okay. So this is a desmosome. Okay. So it's like a bridge connecting the adjacent cells. Okay. So these intermediate filaments that I drew on the plaques here, these are going to extend across the cell's cytosol, which is the liquid portion inside of the cell. Okay, and it helps to keep the tissue stable. So it helps to kind of keep it together and stable. So this is found in the epidermis of the skin. Again, we'll learn about skin in Unit 3, so it's going to still be part of our first big unit. We have 3 units, okay? And it's found between the muscle cells of the heart. So you do want a little bit of space between the muscle cells of the heart so that things can pass through. Okay, so desmosomes. And then finally we have hemidesmosomes. Or sorry, not finally, we also have gap junctions. Okay, so let's talk about hemidesmosomes first. Hemidesmosomes. So hemi means halfway, or half, or in between, something like that, okay? So hemidesmosomes, it looks like half of a desmosome. So this is the type, like I mentioned up here, this is the type that connects the epithelial tissue to the basement membrane, okay? So let's draw that out quickly. So let's say we have a basement membrane here, okay? And then we have a cell. Okay, so we'll say this is like a squamous cell. Okay. Let's do black. Okay, so on our squamous cell, again, we have this plaque. This here. So we have this plaque here, okay, and it has those intermediate filaments on it, just like here, but we just have a cell connected to the basement membrane instead of a cell connected to another epithelial cell. And then we have our transmembrane proteins that connect the plaque here of this cell to the basement membrane. Okay, so something like this, hemidesmosomes. Okay, and then now our final one is going to be gap junctions. So gap junctions are just like what they sound like. There's a large gap between the adjacent cells. Okay. So gap junctions. Okay. So let's say we have our cell here and here. So we want a larger gap here. So we have a few different things going on here. Okay, so we have these connexons, and these are like channels that go between the cells. Okay, so we have like an open channel here connected to another open channel on this cell. Okay, so you have these throughout. So let's draw a few of these. We'll draw just one more to make it simple. So these connexons are proteins that are kind of like pores that are open within the plasma membrane, so allowing things into or to pass between the adjacent cells. Okay, and you can see there's this here would be like the large gap between these cells. Okay, so that's gap junctions. So they'll allow ions and other small molecules to pass freely from one cell to another, whereas tight junctions don't really let much of anything in. Adherent junctions would let maybe a tiny bit of things in. Same thing with desmosomes and hemidesmosomes. These are just like anchoring cells to the basement membrane. Okay, gap junctions can allow ions and small molecules to pass freely, and also electrical impulses can pass freely from one cell to another in a gap junction. Okay, so this is found in smooth and cardiac, muscle, tissue, and the nervous system. Okay, so cardiac muscle in general, and neurons are electrically excitable, meaning electricity can pass through them, or there's like a change in voltage. So we want these gap junctions in these areas to allow that electrical excitability to occur. Okay, so gap junctions. So make sure you know for these different cell junctions what they look like if I were to show you pictures. So again, make sure you look through the PowerPoint and see the actual pictures of these. Also make sure that you know their functions and where they're found in the body. Okay. All right, so let's get back to our different types of cells. Okay, so let me erase this and we'll go back to our 4 different types of tissue that we are going to talk about. Okay, so again, we have epithelial, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Okay, so let's take our arm for example. We can find all 4 of these types of tissue within the arm. So epithelial tissue is going to make up our skin. Underneath it, we're going to have connective tissue to support our skin, and adipose tissue or fat tissue is also a type of connective tissue. So we'll get into all the different types of epithelial, connective, and muscle tissues, and there's only basically one type of nervous tissue that we're going to talk about. But epithelial, connective, and then we have muscle that's going to be attached to our bones so that we can move our body. So if we have a question in class, we could raise our hand, or we're able to move our bones with our muscle tissue. And nervous tissue. Okay, so nervous tissue, we have nerves. This is how we could feel things on our arm, right? We have nerves running through everywhere in our body. Okay, so these are the 4 different types of tissues we are going to talk about. Okay, so let's talk about first the difference between epithelial versus connective tissue. So epithelial tissue does not have its own blood supply. Connective tissue does. That's why connective tissue is always found underneath epithelial, to give nutrients to the epithelial tissue. Connective tissue, lots of connective tissue does have a blood supply, but not all does. So cartilage does not have a blood supply. Okay. Epithelial tissue also has cells that are closely packed together. Okay, like our cells that we drew with all those junctions, our squamous cells, are kind of flat cells like this, and they're very closely packed together, right? They're connected by those tight junctions where things cannot get through. Okay, so these would be like our squamous cells. They're very tightly packed together. When we're talking about connective tissue, it's a lot looser. The cells aren't so, there are a few cells like scattered throughout connective tissue. So we'll have like different fibers, like collagen, for example. So I'll have like these loose fibers, and then we'll have some cells. So I'll just draw like the neurons of some different cells. So I'll have some cells throughout. And then mostly it's going to be fluids, ground substance, and lots of those fibers. Okay. So connective tissue is a lot looser than our epithelial tissue, which have tightly packed together cells connective tissue does not have a blood supply, or connective tissue for the most part does have a blood supply except for cartilage, whereas epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply. Okay. In epithelial tissue, mitosis occurs frequently. So our epithelial cells are sloughing off or falling off all day long every day, and then mitosis just replaces them, right? So we just create more skin cells to replace them. They move up the line to the top layer of the skin. Okay. Epithelial, even though it's avascular, so it doesn't have those blood vessels that I was talking about, does have a nerve supply. So we'll get into that when we get to skin as well in the next unit. But it does have nerves. That's how we're able to feel like touches, pressure, pain, and temperature in our epithelial tissue as well. Okay. Epithelial tissue is found above a basement membrane. So let's say we have our basement membrane here. So here's our epithelial tissue, ET, and here's our basement membrane. And then we would have our connective tissue underneath that. So here's our connective tissue. Okay, so this is always how it goes. Epithelial tissue connected to a basement membrane, and underneath is going to be that supportive connective tissue. Okay. In epithelial tissue, there's also lots of cell junctions present, whereas connective tissue doesn't have cell junctions, right? Because the cells are so spread far apart from each other. Okay, so let's start with our epithelial tissue. So how do we classify epithelial tissue? So epithelial tissues are going to have two different names for them. So the first name is going to be how many cells there are. So for epithelial, we have simple. This means one layer. Stratified. This means more than one layer. And we have what's known as pseudostratified. There's only one type that's pseudostratified. So pseudo means fake. Okay, so these look like they're stratified. This is also one layer, but looks like more than one. So pseudostratified, there's only one type, which is columnar. And then the second word, we'll get into that in more detail in a little bit, so I'm not just brushing over, okay. And then the second word describes the shape of the cell. So we have squamous. Those are the ones I've been drawing here. They're these flattened looking cells with a central nucleus. We have cuboidal. Which look like little cubes. They actually look a lot more round under the microscope and in the actual tissue. We'll draw them as little cubes for now. We have columnar, just like it sounds like, they look like columns. So they're taller than they are wide. So those are the ones I was drawing when I was showing you the different cell junctions. And they also have a central nucleus. And then we have a kind of tricky one, not really tricky, but it's known as transitional. And again, just like what it sounds like, right? This just describes the shape. So transitional is found in places where there's a lot of stretch, like in the bladder. So when the bladder is filled with urine, it stretches open. And when we dispel urine, it shrinks back to its normal size, so it's elastic. Okay? So you'll find transitional tissue there, where at some spots it looks more squamous. And then as you keep moving down, so let's draw some squamous first. Okay. And then as you keep moving down, it starts to look more cuboidal. So you can tell, it looks like it's been stretched. Looks like it's been tissue that's been stretched. Okay. So this would be transitional. So anytime you see a tissue that looks different as you move down the tissue, that's transitional. Okay, types of, or this is how epithelial tissue is named. Okay, so epithelial tissue makes up our skin, it surrounds our organs, it also makes up glands in the body. So let's quickly kind of sidestep here and talk about glands for a minute. Okay. So glands can be endocrine glands, which secrete things within the body. So this would be hormones, or exocrine. So exo, like exit. So these are like our sweat glands, oil glands, and what secretes earwax or cerumen inside the ear. Okay, it's a modified sweat gland. So those are exocrine glands. They secrete onto the surface of skin, whereas endocrine stay inside. Endo is like inside the body. Okay, so those secrete different hormones like testosterone, oxytocin, all of our different hormones. Okay, you'll learn a lot more about those in A&P2. Okay. So glands are made up of this epithelial tissue as well. Okay. So glands are made up of cuboidal tissue. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get into simple and stratified cuboidal tissue. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, but I just wanted to mention glands. Okay, there's also one gland I forgot to mention would be goblet cells. So within our columnar cells, within our, let's say, our intestines, right, they secrete mucus as well. Okay, so there will be cells in between these columnar cells. Under the microscope, they always look white. So you'll have your columnar cell, and then you'll have a few goblet cells sprinkled in. So let's say we have our 3 goblet cells, and then it's more of like a large rounded cell, and it's just going to be white. Okay, you're not going to see the nucleus or anything to that, and then you'll see another columnar cell, etc. So this here would be our goblet cell. And you'll see all of these different tissues under the microscope in lab. Okay, and you'll need to be able to differentiate between them. So do make sure that you take notes on those and spend your time in lab looking at those slides. Okay. All right. Let's also sidestep for a minute and talk about different membranes in the body. Okay. So membranes are very flat sheets of tissue that cover or line different parts of the body. Okay. So we have epithelial membranes. Okay. So the cutaneous membrane, this would be our skin. Okay. Our epidermis and dermis layer are known as the cutaneous membrane. Serous membrane, so we talked about serosa coverings in Unit 1. Or mucous membranes. Okay. So membranes that produce mucus. And then we have different membranes known as synovial membranes. So we'll learn a lot more about synovial membranes when we get to joints. Okay, but synovial membranes are found between connecting long bones, and they're filled with fluid. Okay, and they're covered with hyaline cartilage, which we'll learn about. Okay, and it's so that our bones don't scrape up against each other. Okay, so protection from friction. Just like our serous membranes are also for protection of friction. Remember we talked about lining our lungs, for example. There's a serous membrane known as the pleura, okay, and it has a visceral layer. Most of our serous membrane surrounding our organs has a visceral layer, which is directly connected to the lungs in this case. Then it has a parietal layer, and in between those layers you would find serosal fluid, okay, or pleural fluid, if we're talking about the lungs, and that helps to reduce friction between neighboring organs, okay. So do make sure you know those different membranes. There's pictures of them in the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, so we'll get back to epithelial tissue and connective tissue a little bit later. Let's talk about muscle tissue. So there's 3 types of muscle tissue, like I discussed earlier: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. Okay. Skeletal muscle tissue helps us to move our body, helps us to maintain our posture, and produces some heat as well. Cardiac muscle tissue is found surrounding our heart, so it's specialized for the heart. It has those gap junctions, okay, between these cells, and it's for pumping blood through the body. And then smooth muscle tissue is found surrounding our other organs, like the stomach, for example. Okay, so in the stomach helps us to turn our food. In the esophagus, we have muscle that helps to push our food down into the stomach. Okay, so there's muscle surrounding all of our different organs there. Okay. And then we have nervous tissue. So here we're just doing a brief overview of all these different tissues, okay? And then we have nervous tissue. So we have neurons. Let's write this here, neurons. So these are the cells that actually send those rapid signals throughout the body. And we have neuroglia. Neuroglia. These are also known as glial cells. These are support cells for neurons. Okay. So most neurons, they have a cell body. I'll draw a really bad neuron for you. So they have a cell body, there's a nucleus, there are these dendrites coming off of the cell body that get a signal from another neuron. Then there's a long axon. This is a typical motor neuron. There's a few different types we'll learn about at the very end of this semester. Okay, and then the axon terminals with the synaptic end bulbs. Okay, so the signal is sent here, and then this neuron can communicate with an effector like a muscle or a gland, or can communicate with the dendrites of a next neuron. Okay, so they carry either sensory information to the brain and spinal cord, or they carry information from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles or glands. So that would be motor information. So neurons and muscle fibers, like I said, those are known as excitable cells. So they have electrical signals. They're electrically excitable. Okay, so make sure you do know that. Okay, let's talk about repair in the tissues. So, like I said, epithelial tissue can be replaced by a mitosis. Okay, so our epithelial tissue cells are dying all the time. So they're always being replaced by mitosis. Okay. Some connective tissue cells can repair, but some cannot. Muscle cells can perform very limited repair, but if you do damage a muscle, it does take a long time for it to repair, okay, if it ever does, depending on how severe it is, where it's found, etc. And then nervous tissue, for the most part, cannot perform repair. Some nervous cells can perform a very limited repair, but most cannot. Okay. When things do repair, if it's something deep enough, like a deep enough wound, scar tissue will form. So it's like this thicker type of tissue. Okay, so that process is known as fibrosis, formation of scar tissue. Okay, and then let's quickly talk about aging. So as we age, what happens to our tissues here? Okay. So when we're younger, we typically have a better nutritional state and better blood supply to the tissue and a faster metabolic rate. Okay, so as we age, our tissue repair is going to happen a lot slower. Okay, and we lose our elasticity. Okay, so this is what causes like the sagginess in skin. It doesn't go back to normal due to gravity, things like that. Okay. So loss of elasticity happens in age as well. Okay, so let's talk about epithelial tissue in a lot more detail, and we'll go into all the different types of epithelial tissue. Okay, all right. So let's erase all this. So what we have here. I'll leave this up actually. Let me just fix this. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about some modifications of our epithelial tissue. Okay, so in our respiratory system, mostly, we have these little hair-like projections coming off of the epithelial tissue known as cilia. Okay, so let's say we have our cuboidal cell here, for example. We'll just show them as cuboidal cells. Okay, with our little nucleus there. These here would be cilia. They come off of the apical surface. Let's talk about that for a second too. So here we have our epithelial cells. Here we have our basement membrane. And here we have our connective tissue. Okay, with some of our cells throughout here. Okay, so again, should let this part out. Epithelial tissue, basement membrane, connective tissue, okay? We have an apical side and a basal side. So this here would be our apical side. This is the area that's open to like the free space or fluids within the body. Okay, so this would be the apical side, open to free space or fluids within the body. This here would be our basal side. So it's where the epithelial tissue connects to the basement membrane. Okay, so it's pretty simple when we're talking about something like this, but we also have, like I mentioned, glands. So let's talk about that really quickly. What would be the apical side and the basal side? So in a gland, we have these cuboidal cells right next to each other, forming this circle, right? Glands secrete things, so it has this open space in the center. Okay, so here's our gland. Let's draw our nuclei quickly to make this a little bit accurate. Around the gland on the outside, you'll see a thin basement membrane. And then you'll probably see another gland. Maybe, or you'll see a different type of tissue. So let's say this is just part of another gland. Okay, so within here, this is known as the lumen. So the lumen in the body is the inside of something, or the open area inside of something. So within our blood vessels are long tubes as well. So this would be our blood vessel here. This would be the lumen inside the blood vessel, L-U-M-E-N. Okay, so this is the lumen. This here would be the apical side. And this here would be the basal side. So it's a little bit different when you talk about glands, because the basal side is on the very outside and the apical is on the inside where the lumen is. So I just wanted to point that out quickly. Okay, so cilia are those little hair-like projections found mostly in the respiratory system. So you have a lot of mucus in the respiratory system. The cilia helps to push the mucus along and also get any debris out from the respiratory system, because we do not want debris being breathed into the lungs, right? We only want air within the lungs, nothing else. So these cilia help to move debris and things along. Other modifications, we have those goblet cells that I talked about. So those are found within their modified columnar cells, and they secrete mucus. And then we have microvilli. So microvilli are found on large cells. So these will be found on columnar cells. So we have our long columnar cell here, and then we have these like finger-like projections coming off of it. These here are the microvilli. Okay, here would be our nucleus here. Okay, so I'll just get into why microvilli is important quickly, but you'll learn a bit more about it when you get to digestive system. Microvilli help to increase the surface area of the cell to make a large cell more efficient. Okay, so you'll find these in the intestines, like especially in the small intestine, because that's where most of our nutrient absorption occurs. And we have these large, maybe inefficient columnar cells in the small intestines, but they're efficient because we have these microvilli added to them. So these allow for greater absorption of nutrients in the small intestines, okay, microvilli. Okay, so you can look for that in the cells as well. Okay, so let's get into all the different types of epithelia. Okay, so I'm going to erase this stuff here. We'll talk about all the different types of epithelia. Okay, so let's talk about our simple epithelia first. So first we have simple squamous. Simple squamous. So this is one layer of our flattened or scale-shaped cells. Okay, so you'll find these simple squamous cells in areas that are very small. So some of our very small blood vessels, okay, have these simple squamous. So let's draw like a little blood vessel here. So like a capillary, for example, is like our smallest type of blood vessel, and they connect arteries and veins to each other. So this would be the lumen or inside of our small blood vessel here, and this would be the basement membrane on the outside. So simple squamous cells are for diffusion and filtration. Things can diffuse out of them very easily because they're only one layer thick. So our blood vessels, what's the point of our blood vessels, right? To deliver blood and oxygen to our body. Our red blood cell can squeeze out of these cells. So that's why it's for diffusion and filtration, our simple squamous cells. Okay, so make sure you look at the pictures underneath the microscope in lab, and in the PowerPoint I have photomicrographs of all these different tissues to see what they actually look like under the microscope, okay? So simple squamous. So for all of these, you need to know what they look like in a picture underneath the microscope, of course, for the lab practical. You also need to know their functions and where they're found for the lecture exam, okay? So do make sure you know that. That's gonna be a lot of questions on the lecture exam, okay? So this is found in like our capillaries, are very small blood vessels, and in the alveoli, which are the air sacs of the lungs, and that's also for diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to get into the lungs, okay? Then we have simple cuboidal, so I already showed a picture of that, so it's gonna look kind of similar. So these are found in our glands. Okay, so here's a gland here, here's the lumen of our gland, and the basement membrane of our gland on the outside, and then things are secreted through this open space here, the lumen of the gland. So this here is, I'm just gonna put, I'll write out, simple cuboidal. Okay, simple cuboidal. Okay, also for secretion and absorption because things are, secreted through glands. Okay. So found in kidney tubules, found in smaller glands, whereas our stratified cuboidal would be found in larger glands. And the surface of the ovary also has simple cuboidal tissue. Okay, next we have simple columnar. So one layer of our column-shaped cells. So again, I've drawn this a few times, but it's just our columnar cells next to each other in one layer going across the basement membrane. Okay, simple columnar. Okay, so you can find these lining the intestines. Okay, now, next one I'm going to show you is pseudostratified columnar. Pseudo. So remember, this looks like fake stratified, but it's really one layer. So I'll show you how that works. Columnar. Okay. So here we have our basement membrane. Okay. Now in pseudostratified columnar, there's still those column-shaped cells, but some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. So even though there's only one layer on the basement membrane, it looks like there's multiple layers. Okay. So we'll have one like normal cell here, then we'll have maybe like a smaller one, and then this larger one comes up and over. So a lot of times it looks like 1, 2, or 3 nuclei right on top of each other. Okay, and then we'll have a smaller one here, a larger one here, another larger one here. So it underneath the microscope, it could look like multiple nuclei right on top of each other, but really there's only one layer on the basement membrane there. Okay, we do have stratified columnar as well, which I'll get to. But pseudostratified columnar. So this one, I can always tell which one's pseudostratified because it has those cilia, also known as a brush border. Okay, so let me draw this a little bit thinner. So it has these little cilia coming off. So you need to look closely at the apical side here to see if it's pseudostratified. Okay. You're not going to see that in our regular simple columnar cells. Okay, and during lab, I'm going to help you out as you're going through the microscopes. Please call me over if you need a way to distinguish between two that you can't really tell apart, and I'll give you lots of tips as well, okay? So make sure you do watch this and take some notes on these so that when you're looking through the microscopes, hopefully you can start to try to determine which cell is which, okay? So pseudostratified columnar, remember, it has that brush border, okay? So this is also for secretion and absorption, right? Because those columnar cells are found in the digestive system. So these are found lining the trachea and some ducts and glands as well. Okay, now let's get into our stratified epithelia. So let's do this in a different color to make it a little bit easier to distinguish, okay? So we have stratified squamous. I'm just gonna write strat. Okay, so this is multiple layers of those flattened cells. Okay, so stratified squamous, you'll have these thin cells, we'll have one layer, and then we'll have multiple. Okay. So typically you'll have a lot of layers, but we'll just draw 3 so that we're not here all day. Okay, so stratified squamous, multiple layers of those flattened or scale-like cells. So there's 2 different types. There's keratinized or non-keratinized. Okay, so keratinized has keratin proteins on top, so the dead skin cells basically. So the outside of our skin is keratinized. It helps with waterproofing, helps with abrasion, so the outside of our skin obviously comes into contact with lots of different things, so you need extra protection there. So this is what non-keratinized stratified squamous cells look like. So the inside of our cheek, for example, is non-keratinized stratified squamous, so it's a lot smoother and like softer than the outside of our skin, for example. Keratinized has all these flat, or here, let's draw it above here so I don't have to draw it again. So this is non-keratinized. Keratinized has all these flat, dead keratin cells at the top, and usually has a very thick layer of them. Okay, so make sure you can tell the difference between keratinized versus non-keratinized and what the functions of each would be. Both of them are for protection. That's their main function. But keratinized is for added protection everywhere, places where we have like lots of abrasion, and also for waterproofing. So it helps out with waterproofing the outside of our skin as well. Okay, so it's found on our skin, mostly the outside of our skin. Okay, also like inside of our cheeks. Okay, next would be transitional, or you can call it stratified transitional because it is multiple layers. I just typically call it transitional. Either way is fine for me on an exam. Okay, transitional. But for the other ones, you do need to specify because it could be stratified or simple, or in this case with columnar pseudostratified. Okay, so transitional. Okay, so this is the type that changes its shape. So in some areas it looks more cube-like. I'm just gonna draw 2 layers for simplicity. And then some layers it looks more of those flattened squamous shaped cells. Okay, so transitions. And you'll see under the microscope it does look like a tissue that's really been stretched. Okay, so it's for protection and stretching of tissue. This is found lining the bladder. Okay, next we have stratified cuboidal. All right, stratified cuboidal. Okay, so this is also found in ducts and glands, so like the excretory ducts of the mammary glands, in the salivary and sweat glands as well. Okay, so we have, it's usually just 2 layers. Here, let's draw a little gland here. And then it would have a second layer over that. Okay, so it's usually 2 layers of those cube-shaped cells, and they have their nuclei, of course. Okay, I'm gonna draw Okay, so stratified cuboidal. Okay, main function here is protection, some excretion as well. Okay, stratified columnar. These ones you can usually tell. Sorry. Okay, so stratified columnar. Okay, so it's usually 2 layers of this one as well. So it'd be 1 layer of columnar cells on top of another. Okay, so stratified columnar. So this is for protection and secretion of mucus. Okay, so you may see some goblet cells throughout there as well. Okay, so this is found in mucous membranes lining the eyelid, okay, the pharynx, anus, and the urethra as well. Okay, so this one you also won't see that brush border, so you only see it in pseudostratified. And you should be able to tell stratified versus simple columnar. And if you're ever unsure, look for that brush border. If you see that, it's pseudostratified columnar. Okay. All right, so those are all the epithelial tissues we are going to talk about. Now let's get into connective tissue. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, there's 2 interesting connective tissues which we will talk about. But blood and bone are also considered connective tissues. Okay, so they're also considered connective tissues because they're made up of a matrix. So bone we'll see is made up of a matrix, and blood as well has cells, fluids, proteins, different things within it. So it is considered a matrix, and it is considered a connective tissue. So something you wouldn't really think of, but it is. Okay, so we're done with our epithelial tissue. So I'm going to erase all of this, and then we'll get into connective tissue now. Okay, so we have connective tissue proper, as it's known, which is like general connective tissue. Then we also have different types of cartilage, which I'll talk about. Those ones are avascular, and yeah, we'll talk about those. Those are like somewhere between connective tissue proper and bone, because they're like rigid and supportive like bone. Like the tip of our nose, for example, is made up of cartilage. It helps to give like that point or like tip to our nose. And our ear too, so it helps to give like structure and shape to our ear, our external ear. But it is also somewhat like connective tissue as well. Okay, so now we're talking about connective tissue. Okay, so areolar connective tissue is the most abundant type of connective tissue. So it's like the general packing material of the body. So it's found underneath our, it's surrounding our capillaries, and it's found lining mucous membranes as well. So you'll see all of these fibers, okay? So I have lots of different fibers. So try to make up things like, what does this look like to you, okay? So to me, this one kind of looks like the game of pick up sticks because there's just like lots of different fibers throughout. And then you'll see some cells scattered through as well, okay? This one doesn't look like any of the other ones, so this one's pretty easy to tell apart, okay? So again, for these, you also need to know the function, where they're found, and what they look like, okay, underneath the microscope. Okay, so this here is areolar. I'm just going to put CT for connective tissue. Okay. All right, so areolar connective tissue. Then we have adipose connective tissue. This is fat tissue, basically. So in adipose tissue, this is found in the yellow bone marrow, underneath the skin, and surrounding the eyeball. So again, it's fat tissue. Okay. So it helps to pad, protect, store fat, and to insulate the body. Okay, so it's packed with adipocytes, which are the like fat cells. So the nuclei are pushed to the sides. So you'll see there's like this thin area where it's nuclei, otherwise it's just white under the microscope. Okay, so this one also doesn't look like any of the other tissues. Okay, adipose connective tissue. Okay, then we have dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, this one you'll have collagen fibers found in parallel lines, and they're very densely packed together. Okay, so it looks something like this, dense, regular connective tissue. Okay, this is found in our ligaments and tendons, and its function is strength when pulled in one direction and flexibility. Then we have dense, irregular, so I'm going to draw that right down here. Dense, irregular connective tissue. This one, the fibers, there's lots of fibers here as well, and they're densely packed together, but they're kind of all over the place. So you'll see them kind of like swirling around, and then you'll see like areas of white. So just kind of looks crazy, kind of like this is how I would draw it. But again, make sure you look at the PowerPoint, and in class, you'll see this underneath the microscope. So it kind of looks all crazy, but they are still like they're still densely packed together. Okay, so this is found in the deep layer of the dermis of the skin. Okay, and the function is strength when pulled in many different directions. Okay, elastic connective tissue. Okay, it also looks like lots of, it looks kind of more like thicker fibers. Okay, kind of going all around. Okay, elastic connective tissue. This is found in large arteries and larger airways, and its function is strength and resistance to stretching, right? It remains elastic. Okay, then we have reticular connective tissue. Okay, so this is found in the kidney, in the liver, spleen, lymph nodes, so in lots of like lymphatic areas of the body, Peyer's patches. You'll learn about this in A&P too, but it's lymph tissue in the small intestine, and found in bone marrow. Okay, so you see like lots of densely packed stuff, and you'll see like these darker fibers kind of throughout, and then you'll see like just kind of like ground substance and other fibers. Okay, so reticular connective tissue. So its function is to support organs. That's why it's found surrounding all those different organs. Okay, next we're going to get into different cartilages. So cartilage is avascular, so no blood supply. Okay, so first let's talk about hyaline. I'm going to put cart for cartilage. Okay, so this is the type, it's found in quite a few different places. So this is the type that's found at the ends of our long bones. So where those synovial cavities are, so at the ends of our long bones. If you've ever eaten chicken off the bone, it's like that pulley material, like smooth material at the end of the chicken bone. So there's lots and lots of fibers within hyaline, but they're so densely packed together you can't see them. So it actually looks very smooth and pretty and glossy. Okay. One thing I need to mention though about cartilage, a way you can tell if something is cartilage or if it's connective tissue, cartilage has these things known as lacunae. So lacunae are like open spaces that hold chondrocytes, which are the cells found in cartilage. Okay. So you'll see like this smooth glossy, and then you'll see these lacunae holding the chondrocytes throughout, and the rest of it just looks kind of pretty and smooth. It's usually actually pink. I should have drawn this in pink. Okay, so there are fibers, but you can't tell because everything's just looks very smooth here. Okay, so usually students don't have an issue with this one. This one's pretty easy to tell apart as well. Okay, hyaline cartilage. So it's for flexibility and support. It's also found connecting our ribs to our sternum. Okay, you'll find hyaline cartilage there. And supporting the nose. So this type here that I said was like holding the nose up, that's hyaline cartilage as well. Okay, then we have fibrocartilage. Okay, lots of fibers here, so collagen fibers, and these fibers are visible within the ground substance. So you see like lots of like these thin fibers throughout. And I know some of these look the same. When you look at them under the microscope, they look a lot different. It's just hard to draw these. I'm not an artist, okay? But do make sure you're watching or looking at the PowerPoint as you're watching this, okay? So you can see the fibers. Some areas it looks like more like bunched up fibers, and then they go into like these lines, okay? So fibrocartilage. This is also for flexibility and support, but flexibility and support under like lots of weight, okay? So this is found in our intervertebral discs and in our knee joint, okay, where we have lots of weight, right? Our vertebrae help to support our weight, as do our knees, okay? And then we have elastic cartilage. So we have elastic connective tissue and we have elastic cartilage, okay? So they are different. Cartilage, okay? So this one looks also like kind of messy. So you do have lacunae as well. Oh, in the fibrocartilage, you also have lacunae. It's a little more difficult to see, but you will have like these little spaces throughout that hold the chondrocytes, okay? So elastic cartilage, you'll have the lacunae, and then surrounding them are like thick areas of fibers, okay? So you'll like see these kind of throughout, and then you'll just have thick fibers surrounding them. Okay, there's your little example. Your elastic cartilage. So this is for support and elasticity, so going back to its smaller shape. So external ear, and then the epiglottis as well. Okay, compact bone. This doesn't look like any of the other tissues, so this is technically considered a connective tissue as well. Compact bone, you have these like ring structures. And in between them, you do have lacunae here as well that hold osteocytes, mature bone cells. So you have these like openings with the osteocytes within them. So you have lacunae throughout. Take a look at the microscope and you'll see this doesn't look like anything else. So this is compact bone. And then we have blood. So you'll see a blood smear underneath the microscope, and you'll have different white blood cells. And then you'll mostly have red blood cells. There'll be some platelets as well, which are like little pieces of cells. They're not full cells, so they're just like these little dots. And our red blood cells don't have a nucleus, so they're just like these lightly pink stained cells under the microscope. They don't have a nucleus to make room for hemoglobin to hold oxygen. Okay. We talked about what our nervous tissue already looked like, so I'm not going to get into that again. Again, you could refer to the slideshow to take a look at that, and in class we'll look at it as well. And then muscle. So let's talk about the 3 different types of muscle. So I'm just going to actually erase all of this. So we're done with connective tissue now, and now we're at our final type of tissue, muscle. And again, we have 3 types, right? Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Okay, so skeletal, what does it look like? It's these parallel bundles, so they're right nice and parallel to each other. They have what's known as striations, so these lines going across, they're striated. Smooth muscle doesn't have these, but skeletal and cardiac do. And they're multinucleate, so you'll have nuclei throughout the cell. Okay, so that's skeletal muscle. Okay, so it moves the body by pulling on our bones. Okay, long, cylindrical, it has these striations. So I'll write that here, striations. Okay. It also helps to protect some of our internal organs, and it generates some heat and helps with breathing. Okay, so our diaphragm is that large band of muscle that separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity, and it helps to push air of our lungs. And then when we breathe in, it makes room for our lungs to expand. Okay, cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is more branched. Okay, so it's not parallel. So you'll see something like this. Okay, it also has striations, and then it has these thicker areas known as intercalated discs. And that's where you have the gaps between cells. Okay, so I always look for these intercalated discs if I'm trying to determine if something is cardiac or skeletal muscle, because sometimes under the microscope you can't tell if it looks branched or not. Okay, so you see these little, or these large striations throughout. Okay, so cardiac muscle again is found surrounding the heart. It helps to synchronize contractions of the heart and pump blood throughout our body. Okay, and the cells are connected at those intercalated discs. And then finally we have smooth muscle tissue. It's flat cells, almost like squamous epithelial tissue. So there's no striations, that's why it's known as smooth muscle tissue. This is the type that's found surrounding our organs. So it helps our organs to move, helps to move reproductive tract secretions and different things throughout the body. Okay, also food that we eat helps to move it throughout the body. Okay, so it's these like flattened cells all on top of each other. Okay, smooth muscle tissue. Okay, and they have a single central nucleus. Okay, so yeah, that's it. So we went through nervous tissue. I already showed you, right? There's a cell body, there's these dendrites coming off the cell body, we have a nucleus, then we have our long axon, and then our axon terminals with our synaptic end bulbs down here. Okay, so that's what nervous tissue. It doesn't look like any other type of tissue. A lot of students say this one kind of looks like spiders because of the dendrites and the axon. So that's what that one looks like. Okay, and that's for sending rapid signals throughout the body. Okay, so that's it on Unit 2.